Right, thank you. I'm going to ask all the speakers to come up to the podium and grab a seat. And I'll hand this around for any of you who want to ask a question of any of the speakers.
Over on this thing.
I can talk loud. So my question is maybe an ignorant one, but what about who owns the data? So you're partnering with Johnson & Johnson, so I'm assuming they own the data and they're willing to share it. Harvard and I'm sure other institutions.
We don't take copyright of the data. The data belongs to the authors or the journal, and the journal determines who the data belong to. We just provide the service. We do not retain copyright. We do not make decisions on who gets to access the data or the terms of access that are used on the data.
So you're really just a repository?
Yep.
Okay, and then?
So philosophically, I would actually say that the people own the data, the subjects own the data. Pragmatically, the sponsor owns the data. So we've started to refer to our industry partners as the data holders. And then, again, it's a philosophic issue, but yeah, legally, they're the ones who own the data, and then the data use agreements are between J&J and the people who actually are accessing it. But again, just thinking ahead, we might want to conceptualize this as really it's owned by the participants, and we are just luckily in the position of holding it for the scientific community.
The reason I ask is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that data in Dryad is released, everything is released under CC0. Okay. So it's released into the public domain. We have increasingly been running into situations where things get published and then we hear from other parties later who say, actually, I never gave my permission for this person to publish this into the public domain. So, over time, these situations are starting to come up, and then you have to say, okay, well, let's take out that part of the data that the permission was not provided for. So there are some issues that are coming up.
The reason I ask is I work for a traditional publisher, and it's a not-for-profit publisher, but we just launched an open access journal, but prior to that, when someone submitted an article to us, we got copyright. They signed over copyright to us, and I'm thinking, if you insert the publisher into this scenario, would then the publisher then, especially if they take the review process into account, which is a lot of work, would they then also take the copyright? And I know that's not the direction that things are going in, especially in terms of philosophically or idealistically, but it's just an interesting thing to think about.
You didn't want to address whether data have copyright in the first place?
Are facts copyrightable?
Questions?
So I think my question is going to be directed to Grace. You had mentioned that you endorse certain repositories, and there's a long list that people can choose from. So I wanted to ask you, how do they know that they're choosing the right one? And then as a follow-up question, I think to anybody on the panel is, there are a lot of repositories at this point. What's the security for that data? And if any of those repositories then close down or go away, what happens to the data at that point?
Okay. I'll start with the first part of that question. So in terms of how do authors know which repository to use, it's a really good question, and a lot of authors don't know which repository to use. So our recommended repository list takes the most appropriate discipline-specific repositories. So for a particular field of research, it's grouped by field of research, and then we would recommend the most appropriate repository for that field of research where one exists. About half of fields do not currently have a discipline-specific repository. That's a massive finger in the wind estimate, but about half. So in those cases, we would recommend a number of general repositories, Harvard Dataverse being one, Figshare, Dryad being others.
Did you want to follow?
Just a question, and could they could actually be deposited in more than one if their field is covered, or once it's in one, it's only in one?
Wow, I probably would pass that to Elizabeth or Sonia to talk about, the pros and cons of having data deposited in multiple places.
It's not good practice to deposit your data in multiple places. Repositories are providing these digital object identifiers or permanent links to your data. And when you have data in multiple places, then are you making sure that the data are uploaded in each of those places? Exactly the same data. I've run into across multiple deposits in our repository from the authors. And I'm looking at my screen cross-eyed because I'm like, who did this? Because you think everybody's on board with understanding that you make one copy of the data available because you're preserving the integrity of that data by making sure it's always updated with the versions feature, which tracks your updates from the time you deposit it through all the changes you've made. That's very hard to do when you have data in multiple places, and then you're getting 2 different DOIs that people are citing for your data, and then you need to make sense of all the download counts that these repositories keep track of when you have them under different DOIs. Good practices, actually the only practice should always deposit the data in one place. Repositories are offering long-term preservation. Legally, they can say permanent, right? So they say long-term preservation. If data were to disappear at some point, God only, I don't know anything about when it would disappear. They're keeping these records of the data that it used to exist, where it used to exist, so that it could be found. It would never be that I think repositories would just get rid of your data. They would find you and give it back to you if they needed to, right? I don't think that's the plan for any repository going forward, is to just shut down and return your data to you. They're establishing better and better services. Funders are understanding the need to have these repositories because they're requesting or requiring authors to put their data somewhere. So I don't see these repositories going away, but in terms of depositing one time.
Yes, ideally.
Ideally.
But I would say that in practice, oftentimes what happens is, for a generalist repository like Dryad, a specific article may have files, some files for which there is a specialized repository like GenBank, which should really go there. But there may also be some other stuff that doesn't appropriately go in GenBank. So what Dryad might do in that situation is have a Dryad data package with the other stuff and then a link to the what's in GenBank. So that's a nice compromise. Maybe you have code in GitHub. You link out to that from the Dryad data package. And just in terms of what Dryad is doing about the long-term preservation, we did recently establish a partnership with another group wherein if Dryad is to fold, that group will take Dryad's data and make it publicly accessible. So I think more and more repositories are putting failover situations like that into place.
One challenge to long-term preservation is that for some patients' data, such as the J&J data, there's been a very explicit requirement that the data not leave a centralized server. So our data have all been on a large SaaS server, and investigators can only access it by creating a tunnel into that server. It's not inexpensive, and we're looking for other alternatives, but that speaks to the issue of longevity of the data, because this is not sustainable for a myriad investigators to be paying to maintain data on a server. So we need to find ways that there are de-identified, secure patient data can be stored.
And then just to piggyback on that quickly, that's the thing. I can put a link to supplemental data in Harvard's repository, a link to supplemental data somewhere else. I can't ever guarantee you that that link is going to always work. I can't ever guarantee that you're going to find that data there. We're also working on a tool for sharing sensitive data called data tags, which should be available in Dataverse 5. 4.9 is coming out next week, but that was an incentive to bring the sensitive part of data that people are always asking to share that they can't because they have a public version and they have a version that they can't share, to make that available when they can. There's still a certain level of that data that can be put up. It's not, highly restricted data. It follows Harvard's levels of sensitive data. But again, it makes sense that you can find data in one place when you need to. One of the other things they're doing with Dataverse is we have a version of Dataverse coming out called for SB Grid, which is going to be sharing, I believe, structural biology data. And so they took the software and they're making it so that it can support their type of data, larger data, bigger data, and they're creating a whole new software out of that. So
I'd like to see if I can bring it back to the idea of review. And so one question that maybe each of you has a perspective on would be, given the rarity with which review is actually happening pre-publication for some of journals, and to the extent to which some of the clinical trial data, there may not even be a publication associated with it, simply published as data. How much of pressure is that putting on formal or informal, primarily informal versions of post-publication peer review, and what are you seeing in your experiences at repositories and journals in terms of errors found, revisions requested, problems that arise with stuff that is out there that hasn't undergone pre-publication review? So if you could address that, that'd be great. Each of you probably has a perspective on that, I think.
I'll start with a partial answer, I think, which is that our view and the policy of the vast majority of the journals that we own, including all the Nature-branded journals, is that the peer reviewers and the editors need to have access to the data during the peer review process, and they should be provided access to that data, whether or not that's in a repository, which some journals do require, as I said, or it's on request from the authors. So, and our experience is also that where editors and authors and reviewers have access to that data, that they engage with that data, that the peer review process is, that they're better able to peer review the manuscript. So that's not a full answer to your question. We don't see, I'm not an editor, so I'm not going to speak from a position of expertise here, but we don't see lots and lots of issues of corrections to data. Given the number of articles we publish a year, is relatively small after peer review. But it does happen, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. Given the number of deposits that come in for these journals, I don't see too many requests, but the requests do come in. And what's nice is the author can always go in and edit their data set and then resubmit it for review. My team at our repository, we work closely with all of the journal editors that have a space, and we actually facilitate the communication to say, look, just so you know, this author has submitted or resubmitted a data set for review because they found an error or whatever, and that gets tracked with the versioning system with the file replaced, so it will tell you that a file was replaced and why. But it's not too many. We get a lot of questions about the data from users. So users will come in and say, these variables are not making sense. Of course, we always have to bring them back to the author because we don't know the data that well. We're not the ones that are processing the data in that manner. So we do get those kind of questions, which will raise some questions. We'll go in and we'll do some additional reviews, or maybe they found a file that was corrupt or is not downloading anymore. So we get a little bit. I don't think it's anything that I would call extensive and out of the ordinary for a repository.
Yeah, it does happen with Dryad. Working with a variety of journals, doing data review and having different workflows, there can be miscommunication. So the Dryad workflow is such that at the point when the manuscript is accepted, that is what triggers the Dryad curation process of the data, and then usually gets published right after that. So we will hear from authors saying, oh, I didn't know you were about to publish that. I still needed to work on it, So they weren't necessarily informed about how this was going to work. And then we make some corrections to it afterwards, or we post revised versions of the files. And that's through a versioning process after it's published.
For what it's worth, we've had two major partnerships. The first was with a company called Medtronic, and for that, we partnered with two external groups who were doing a meta-analysis, and we just gave them all of Medtronic's trial data and said, here, go do a meta-analysis for a particular product. And that generated tons of questions. These groups were really proficient in analyzing trial data and doing meta-analysis, and my role on that project was to be like the middle person between the company and the investigators, so they would never speak directly. And gosh, there are probably 15 different very, very detailed analytic questions from each of those study groups. And interestingly, they weren't the same questions. Then when we switched to J&J, but I think because we had these approved protocols and we had the people who are the data users read the protocols, ensure feasibility, we've actually had very few questions. I think because these are very focused and less broad and diffuse questions.
All right, I think we have time for another question. If not, we can thank the speakers and head off to break. Thanks very much.